Welcome to today's episode of the Politicast, the podcast dedicated to learning your policies like your ABCs. The Politicast is an educational podcast intended to educate young and future voters on the governmental systems in place, current events, and the intricacies of elections within the United States. Our goal is to increase voter turnout and interest in politics amongst the youth population. So, without further ado, let's learn about the Supreme Court. As I mentioned, today's topic is going to be covering the intricacies of the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in modern-day democracy is one of the three branches of the United States government. They are responsible for interpreting the Constitution and deciding the constitutionality of certain laws. If you've taken advanced placement or AP government, then you'll know that the Supreme Court is a very important part of this course, and we even have core cases that we are intended to learn. Some of the cases that the Supreme Court delivers sporadically throughout the year can be considered as quote unquote landmark cases. These have significant impact on the greater population of the United States. Examples of landmark cases include the Supreme Court case Gideon versus Wainwright relating to obtaining an attorney, and the Dobbs case or Roe v. Wade, both of which relate and pertain to abortion. Then we also have Brown versus Board of Education, which also pertains to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Now, these landmark cases set something that's going to be talked a lot about today. We're going to be exploring three cases in this episode, but they set something known as precedent. Precedent is what the court uses to make decisions about other cases that they're presented with and can also be passed down to the lower courts to use as precedent as well. Now, the Supreme Court, outside of these landmark major court cases, can also make decisions that affect smaller groups and more niche interests, if you will. For example, a recent Supreme Court case was focused on transgender rights, and it was known as Skrmetti v. the United States. And it was relating to a transgender law regarding access to healthcare for transgender individuals, and the United States Supreme Court just released a decision on this case. Another example is Smith and Wesson was recently involved in a Supreme Court case pertaining to the distribution of firearms and how it, I believe, affected criminal activity and whether or not they were held liable or responsible for the distribution and effect that had throughout communities. Today, we're going to be diving, as I mentioned, more deeply into three of the most recent Supreme Court case decisions that have really been considered landmark and what they truly mean for the citizens of the United States, as well as elections and systems that are currently in place. As a reminder, before I do focus on these episodes, I would always like to say that I am going to do my best to remain nonpartisan and not provide my own opinion on any of these Supreme Court cases. So, before we dive deep into Supreme Court's decisions, I think it's important to discuss some of the recent controversy and what people are really thinking about the Supreme Court in the past couple of months. From what I've heard, from what I've researched, this is where that's coming from. So, one of the most controversial things about the Supreme Court that was embedded in our Constitution for a reason is that the Supreme Court justices, once they're appointed, they serve lifetime appointments. This is because they don't have to technically worry about re-election, running for election, so they're not tending to try and make decisions that, please the people. For example, if I want if I want to re-vote for my elected representative, then they're going to want to do things that make me happy and produce policy that makes me happy. Otherwise, why would I re-vote for them? For the Supreme Court, they don't have to worry about that, and that's the whole point, is that there is a degree of separation that exists between the court justices and the citizens that doesn't necessarily exist with the legislative branch because they're always working to appeal to the interests of the citizens, and they actually have to campaign, max every 6 years, and depending on the role that they're in. So this, for some people, seems like a great thing, and this for other people can seem like, the same person is in the seat, potentially they have gone too old, they're inexperienced, they're outdated, or a lot of arguments that individuals are making against lifetime appointments. I think it's also important to consider another reason that lifetime appointments occur is like you build a breadth and depth of knowledge that you don't really need as much if you're working in more of an elected position because your job is to work with the citizens and appeal to the citizens. But here you need to know precedents, you need to know case law, and a lot of the stuff comes with experience. I think that's a part of the argument for, and against, there are a ton of reasons as well. So there's another part of the Supreme Court that has been a recent side of controversy, which is the political ideation of the justices and how that ties into the decisions that they actually make. The president appoints the Supreme Court justices and then they are confirmed by the Senate. So, for example, a Republican president would be more likely to appoint someone who aligns more closely with the ideology of the Republican Party. Similarly, with a Democratic president, they would do it. People who align with the Democrat Party. I think that really matters is because a lot of people are seeing the ideology shining through in what kind of decisions the court is making. I'm not gonna give like a specific case example, but like for example, gun control, Democrats or left-leaning individuals are more for, gun control, restricting how many guns individuals can buy versus right-leaning individuals are more pro-gun. And in a Supreme Court case, when there's, for example, a decision about like gun control, you can probably more likely tend to see the left-leaning individuals maybe vote more for how it favors gun control, and then the right-leaning would probably vote against how it favors gun control. This varies slightly, and not all of the cases are super partisan. Certain cases, like one of the cases that we're going to be talking about, which is the Supreme Court Dobbs case, it's definitely, you can see political ideology leaning more into the Supreme Court's decision, which has been another clash that occurs in the Supreme Court. And technically, justices don't say that they're Democratic or Republican. They all kind of work together to come to a decision most of the time. So today we're going to be focusing on three cases. These three cases are actually vastly different. One of them relates to affirmative action. The second one relates to abortion access, and the third one relates to presidential immunity. So starting off with case number one, which is going to be Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard University and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So this case breaks down affirmative action and it deals with the constitutional principle of the Equal Protection Clause, which is a part of our 14th Amendment. And quite honestly, as I mentioned, Brown v. Board set a big precedent for this. In AP Gov, if you've taken the course or in like some standard government classes, you see that this is a pretty common amendment that does get referenced in Supreme Court cases. And so basically, beginning with this case was decided in 2023, and it continues to be highly prevalent in college admissions to this day. The main issue was essentially that affirmative action, which was revolving around race-based conscious admissions, pursuant to the Supreme Court, violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So they had instated race-conscious admissions to aid marginalized communities to get into college. That was turned over by this decision, and it was made, to be a quote-unquote violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Now, the impacts of this obviously are that current college admission data is showing a lack or decline in Black and Latino, who are traditionally, minority communities, enrollment rates at some elite institutions, including Ivy Leagues and Ivy Plus schools. We also have universities trying to, almost skirt around the decision and find a different way to continue this process by exploring alternatives such as adversity scores or socioeconomic based admissions. And I think honestly, this was a case that also brought to light legacy admissions. If you know what legacy admissions is for example, if my parent or my grandparent attended X university, I would be considered a legacy because both my parents went there. And as a result, that would actually increase in most schools. Some schools have gotten rid of it now because of this case, but like increase my chances of getting admitted into a certain school. So affirmative action has kind of brought a lens and a microscope on legacy admissions as well in the college admission process. Why it's relevant to today is there are that millions of people applying to United States colleges. There are plenty of other controversies going around about, international students, etc., coming into United States colleges, but the college admissions process has become increasingly more competitive, and this is only going to further exacerbate that and bring more attention to that. And it's going to be really interesting to see how 2 years after this court case decision, how things are going to be playing out in the 2026 admission cycle, 2027 admission cycle as well, regarding affirmative action and race-conscious admissions. So the next case that we're going to be focusing on is another very, very controversial and politically charged case, which was the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, and it continues to affect thousands of Americans around the country. So a quick summary of this case. The Dobbs case, which overturned Roe v. Wade, which was a historic landmark case that federally protected abortion, and the Dobbs case essentially removed that protection and gave the rights um, to the states. And following this decision, essentially 20 states have now full, total, or near ban on the practice of abortion. Resulting in this kind of ban, there have been tons of youth-led movements, adult-led movements in states that are against abortion. Ohio, Arizona, some of these states are on the edge, and Florida, and they work to reinstate reproductive rights, and they're doing this through ballot measures, initiatives, referendums, etc. Abortion throughout this country's history has been an incredibly controversial topic, but it's also a big platform that many left-leaning candidates really stand on, that is giving the right back to individuals. Many left-leaning candidates tend to promote the pro-choice movement, giving women the choice. And similarly, many right-leaning individuals stand on the platform of pro-life, so keeping the child. So this has actually been a key topic and an election driver for Gen Z. And abortion rights is a really big part of society, and a lot of people actually consciously are looking into them and making their voting decisions based on them, because it's also important to consider that Dobbs really affected not only abortion rights but other organizations and brought scrutiny to other organizations, including Planned Parenthood, and various birth control contraceptives, and really putting the big question mark on where are we drawing the line? What is the difference? And it's going to be very, very interesting to see how the fight for the Democrats or the left-leaning individuals fight for bringing back abortion is going to look like in under the Trump presidency, but even just leading up to our 2028 presidential election. And it's important to see how much of a priority it's going to be for a lot of our leaders, because I think that is really going to affect how a lot of Generation Z is going to be voting, and a lot of Gen Z will actually be voting in that 2028 election, and even substantial amount in these 2026 midterm elections. So that is going to be something super critical to actually see. So now, last but not least, we have a third case, which relates directly to presidential immunity, and it's actually our most recent case. And it was President Trump versus the United States. So the final one that we're going to be talking about is very controversial, and it recently just came out, and it regards to presidential immunity and President Trump, our current president, versus who went up against the United States of America. This was a landmark Supreme Court case, and it stated that former presidents are basically immune from prosecution because for any official acts that they've done in office. So basically any official things, official actions that they took in office, they are immune from prosecution of those acts. This case was a result largely of President Trump's efforts to dismiss the charges that were brought against him on the January 6th insurrection that occurred following the 2020 election. And let's talk about how this case really sets a strong precedent and can be extremely controversial. So it set the precedent that some individuals, that led some individuals to feel like it was weakening democratic accountability, i.e., President Trump was convicted for the 2020 insurrection, and now individuals may feel as though that it's not necessarily holding up democratic accountability, providing him immunity. Others believe that it was valid due to his role as the president of the United States. Furthermore, it's important to look at the fact that President Trump has a lot of battles going on in the lower courts as well as states. suing President Trump for withholding money. And this was a huge standpoint that was taken by President Trump's legal team to further kind of essentially help, with those lower court state battles. I think there's a lot of contention surrounding this just because of the contentious presidency that has happened for the past year and how so many people are reacting very differently to the presidency. And it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this case is used in other cases, but also in the next 4 years, how this case is going to apply to actions that we see taken by our president. So, thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Politicast. I know it was a little more controversial than some of our other ones, but it's very imperative to be informed about controversies. They're a huge part of our political sphere and they continue to impact us on the daily. Drop a comment down below to tell me your favorite Supreme Court case, and I can't wait to see you all in the next episode. Today's quiz question is going to be how many Supreme Court justices are there and how many true Supreme Court justices are on the Supreme Court? The answer will be in the description box down below. Once again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode.